In the heart of a village that slept beneath the illusion of peace, a single scream shattered the quiet, raw, desperate, and silenced too soon. They said St. Mary's was a place where nothing ever truly happened, where the days were predictable, the nights uneventful, but beneath the polite smiles and warm greetings, shadows twisted in the corners, hiding secrets no one dared whisper aloud. And now, as the town square stood eerily still, a truth long buried was about to claw its way back to the surface, a truth that could tear the village apart. Miss Eleanor Graves sat at her modest breakfast table, the golden morning light slipping through the lace curtains in soft, delicate ribbons, a fine porcelain cup of tea, its surface barely rippled by the stirring spoon, sat beside a plate where toast, thinly crisped and generously spread with citrus marmalade, rested untouched. Her knitting needles lay idly at the ready, but her hands remained still, listening to the quarrelsome chatter of sparrows nestled in the ivy along her cottage's stone walls. It was a morning like any other in Ashford Hollow, quiet, measured, predictable, just as she preferred. But predictability was a fragile thing, shattered in an instant by 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the mantel clock, 9:30, an unusual hour for visitors. Early callers meant only one thing, news, and news in Ashford Hollow spread faster than a summer storm. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Beatrice Holloway standing before her, cheeks flushed, breath uneven, and her extravagantly feathered hat slightly askew, as if she had rushed all the way. Without waiting for an invitation, she swept inside with the air of someone well accustomed to being welcomed. "Oh, Eleanor, you'll never believe it," she exclaimed, her voice quivering with the weight of scandal. "Have you heard?" "No, of course you haven't. You never do. You must get out more." Eleanor, suppressing a sigh, turned toward the kitchen. Scandal in Ashford Hollow was usually of the milder sort, missing jewelry, misplaced wills, or a disagreement over garden hedges. Nevertheless, she retrieved another teacup, knowing well enough that nothing quelled gossip quite like the offering of tea. "Do sit, Beatrice, you must be winded from carrying such important news." But Beatrice barely acknowledged the cup, waving it aside with an air of urgency. "It's Mr. Lawrence Pritchard, arrested. Eleanor, arrested for embezzlement and," she paused dramatically, leaning forward, "murder." Eleanor, ever composed, merely stirred her tea. "Murder," she echoed, her voice even unreadable. "That is quite serious." "Serious? It's scandalous," Beatrice exclaimed. "Edward Wexley was found dead in his study, locked from the inside, no less. They say Pritchard lost a fortune in that failed investment scheme of theirs. Motive enough, wouldn't you say?" Eleanor's mind conjured the image of Edward Wexley, broad-shouldered, domineering, a man who wielded both wealth and words like weapons. He had not, she recalled, been widely beloved. "How dreadful," she murmured, lifting her teacup. "And his poor wife, Margaret, losing a husband so suddenly." Beatrice nodded fervently, already emboldened by the unfolding drama. "They say they argued," a loud vicious row heard by half the town. Eleanor, knowing well that marriages often harbored secrets beneath their polished exteriors, simply nodded. As her tea cooled, the gossip simmered, boiling over into speculation about Margaret Wexley's extravagance and the coincidental timing of Pritchard's financial ruin. "It's all so shocking," Beatrice declared, draining her cup at last. "Ashford Hollow hasn't seen such a stir in years, and poor Judge Alistair Redfern, imagine presiding over this mess." At this, Eleanor's expression remained mild, though her gaze sharpened ever so slightly. "Judge Redfern?" "Oh yes," Beatrice huffed, straightening her hat. "A man of impeccable character, but you know how people talk." She sighed dramatically, then stood, brushing non-existent crumbs from her skirt. "Well, I must be off. So much to discuss, so little time." Eleanor followed her to the door, watching as Beatrice hurried down the path, her voice already carrying over the hedge to another unfortunate listener. Alone once more, Eleanor lingered in the silence, fingers resting lightly against the rim of her teacup. Predictability had indeed been shattered this morning, and in the quiet hum of her thoughts, she knew this mystery was only beginning. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air as Miss Eleanor Graves stepped onto the cobbled path, her sensible hat tilted just so against the brisk autumn wind. The village of Ashford Hollow was waking in its usual unhurried manner. Milk carts rattled down the lanes, children's laughter echoed across the green, and a distant church bell chimed the passing hour. But beneath the placid surface, something restless stirred. A sharp rap on the door had come earlier, carrying the breathless urgency of Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, whose words still lingered, thick with scandal and self-importance. "Eleanor, it's Lawrence Pritchard, arrested, embezzlement and murder." The accusation had settled over the morning like a creeping frost, and now, as Eleanor made her way into the heart of the village, she could feel its weight in the very air. The general store was a hub of whispered half-truths and over-sweetened tea, where fact and fiction wove together as tightly as the bolts of fabric stacked behind the counter. The bell jangled as she stepped inside, met by the keen gaze of Mr. Simmons, his apron smudged with flour. "Morning, Miss Graves," he greeted, voice rich with unspoken "No papers just came in, full of that Pritchard business." "A terrible thing, indeed," she murmured, glancing over the neat rows of barley sugars before adding, almost idly, "Mrs. Holloway mentioned Judge Redfern's name in connection." Mr. Simmons' brows lifted ever so slightly, and he leaned forward as if drawn by the pull of secrecy. "Talk is Margaret Wexley's been seen visiting the judge's estate more than once." Could be nothing, of course, but well, folk do wonder. From the back room, Jenny, the young shop assistant, emerged with a crate of apples, her expression alight with something far sharper than innocence. "My aunt says Mrs. Wexley and Judge Redfern were thick as thieves before she married Edward," she offered, stacking apples with exaggerated precision. "Jenny," Mr. Simmons chastised, though not too sternly, after all in Ashford Hollow gossip was as much a currency as the coins exchanged at the till. Eleanor merely smiled, gathering her parcels. "People assume so much," she said lightly, "but assumptions are not always the truth, are they?" Outside, the village bustled in its measured rhythm, but Eleanor knew secrets did not stay buried for long, not here. And as her boots crunched along the damp road, she let her thoughts unfurl. Money, resentment, whispered affairs, motives stacked upon motives. The courthouse loomed ahead, a heavy structure of aged stone and solemn purpose. Within its walls, the air was thick with expectation, the wooden benches crowded with eager onlookers, their murmurs slithering through the dimly lit chamber. Eleanor took her place at the back, beside Beatrice Holloway, whose feathered hat swayed precariously with each whispered remark. The scent of old parchment and polished wood mixed with something else, not quite fresh, not quite right. At the front of the room, Lawrence Pritchard sat motionless, his dark suit immaculate, but the rigid set of his jaw betrayed the storm beneath. His sharp gaze flicked between his solicitor and the towering figure at the bench, Judge Alistair Redfern. Across the aisle, Margaret Wexley sat shrouded in mourning, her gloved hands clenched into pale fists upon her lap. Was it grief, or something far more deliberate? The only certainty was that, beneath the veil, her eyes did not waver from the man accused of her husband's murder. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound slicing through the murmurs like a blade. "The court is now in session," he intoned, his voice a measured weight of authority. "Lawrence Pritchard is charged with the embezzlement of funds and the murder of his former business associate Edward Wexley. The prosecution may begin." A thin, sharp-eyed man rose, papers in hand, and the courtroom hushed as he spoke. But Eleanor was watching something else. The flicker in Margaret Wexley's hands, the shift in Lawrence Pritchard's expression, the unspoken tension in the judge's posture. In Ashford Hollow, people were always watching, always assuming, but understanding that was a different matter entirely. The truth, buried deep within the shadows of an abandoned manor, was finally ready to be unearthed. A chilling November wind whispered through the trees as the day of reckoning approached. The legend of the cursed estate was nothing more than a tale for the superstitious. What truly mattered were the secrets woven into its walls, hidden behind every velvet curtain and locked door. Judge Edwin Langley, a man known for his unwavering sense of justice, sat presiding over a trial that was more than just a case of guilt or innocence. It was a tangled web of past sins, whispered betrayals, and a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. In the defendant's chair sat Nathaniel Claythorne, a man whose sharp mind had earned him wealth, but whose unreadable gaze now carried only two things: love that had long since slipped away and fear that had only just begun to take hold. The prosecution, led by the formidable Gerald Fawkes, a lawyer feared as much as he was respected, was determined to turn evidence into a story so damning that no man could escape its weight. Miss Edith Lancaster's murder was not just a crime, it was a carefully orchestrated act of deception, Fawkes declared, his voice slicing through the courtroom like a blade. But Miss Marple, seated quietly among the spectators, knew better. She watched, not just the words being spoken, but the silent language of the accused. Nathaniel's restless fingers, Judge Langley's sweat-dampened brow, and most of all Margaret Claythorne, who had yet to lift her gaze from the polished wooden floor. Was she grieving her murdered sister, or was she drowning in a fear of her own making? Every moment in this courtroom felt like a carefully rehearsed performance, yet the script had a missing page. When Fawkes presented a letter, one that spoke of an undisclosed friendship between Nathaniel and Judge Langley, the air thickened, and the room held its breath. A long-buried photograph was revealed, capturing a broken man, a fading woman, and a car parked outside the cursed manor, waiting for someone who would never return. Judge Langley exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple as though bracing himself for the storm to come. "The walls of this courtroom have held many secrets," Miss Marple murmured, "but the truth never stays buried forever." The question was no longer just about who had killed Edith Lancaster, it was about who had the most to lose once the truth finally came to light. The air inside the courtroom crackled with something unseen yet undeniable, a force not bound by law but by the weight of hidden truths. Murmurs cascaded through the gallery, some voices steeped in sympathy for the disgraced judge, others laced with scorn. Yet beneath the clamor, Miss Eleanor Hargrave saw the invisible hand at work. This was no coincidence. The letter, its arrival precise and damning, had been a move in a larger game, and its sender had calculated its impact with ruthless efficiency. The trial had not merely taken a sudden turn, it had been steered. But who was the architect of this upheaval? Beyond the courthouse, in the quiet heart of Ravensbrook, the vicarage stood solemn and untouched by scandal, at least on the surface. Inside, Reverend Alistair Montrose poured tea with the same patient reverence as he did his Sunday sermons, while his wife, Cecilia, watched Miss Hargrave with sharp, searching eyes. A plate of scones lay between them, untouched. "Miss Hargrave," Cecilia said at last, her voice smooth but edged with anticipation, "you must have thoughts on all this. The trial, the letter, the disgrace. One could say the town has never seen such excitement." Reverend Montrose sighed, stirring his tea with slow, deliberate movements. "Excitement is hardly the word, Cecilia. A man's name has been blackened, and justice has been thrown into doubt." Miss Hargrave, her delicate hands wrapped around the fragile porcelain teacup, offered a knowing smile. "Names and reputations, such fragile things, aren't they? And yet they can be ruined with just a few inked words, well placed and well timed." She took a measured sip before setting the cup down. "The question isn't whether the letter is true, the question is why it arrived when it did." Cecilia's eyes gleamed. "You think it was a ploy?" Miss Hargrave tilted her head, considering. "A ploy is too crude a word. No, this was something far more sophisticated, a disruption, a diversion. Someone wanted to shake the foundation of the trial, and they have succeeded." The vicar frowned, his gaze troubled. "But who? And to what end?" Miss Hargrave's gaze drifted to the flickering candlelight, watching the wax drip in slow, inevitable rivulets. There are only ever two reasons to expose a truth, either to serve justice or to bury a greater lie beneath it. The room sat in silence for a moment, save for the distant toll of the church bell. Cecilia, ever the collector of whispers, finally leaned forward, her voice hushed yet urgent. "Then I suppose the only question left is, whose lie is it?" That evening, as the last of the sun bled into the horizon, Miss Hargrave walked the narrow path toward Ashworth Hall. Margaret Lockwood had agreed to meet her, surprisingly so. The widow had spent the trial in the background, her presence subdued but never unnoticed. The grand manor loomed ahead, dark windows like hollow eyes peering down at her approach. There was something different about the village tonight, a stillness, unnatural and waiting. Miss Hargrave had spent a lifetime peeling back the layers of deception that polite society wore so well, and she knew, with an unsettling certainty, that before the night was through, another truth, buried deeper than the rest, was about to be unearthed. The village of Blackthorn Hollow lay in an unsettling hush, as though time itself had hesitated to move forward. Each house, each carefully pruned hedge and cobbled path, seemed trapped beneath an unspoken weight, secrets woven into the very air. The sky, a dull shade of grey, cast elongated shadows over the narrow streets, where the whispers of villages barely carried in the wind. There was something about this place, something heavy, something expectant. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for a truth that refused to surface. When Miss Eleanor Vale reached the looming iron gates of Ashwick Manor, she allowed herself a moment to absorb the sight before her. The estate, once a place of grandeur and whispered aristocracy, now bore the scars of its fading prestige, ivy crawling hungrily over its weathered stone walls, windows dulled with dust and time, and the distant echoes of its former elegance clinging to its silhouette. It stood just beyond the village, close enough to be known yet distant enough to feel otherworldly. The wrought iron creaked as she pushed through, its sound swallowed instantly by the oppressive silence that clung to the manor like a shroud. The heavy oak door opened slowly, revealing Margaret Ashwick, a woman veiled in mourning, though the grief did not quite reach her eyes. The deep shadows beneath them suggested sleepless nights, but whether from sorrow or something else, Miss Vale could not yet say. Margaret's posture was rigid, every movement careful, deliberate, like a performer reciting lines they had rehearsed too many times. "Miss Vale," she said at last, her voice polite but cool, "I was not expecting company." Miss Vale stepped inside, her sharp gaze sweeping over the dimly lit corridor. The house carried the scent of aged wood, lingering perfume, and something else, something stale, as if the walls themselves had been forced to hold their breath. Portraits of long-dead Ashwicks lined the walls, their oil-painted eyes dark and unyielding, watching with a knowing silence. The candlelight flickered against their frozen expressions, casting uneasy shadows across their faces. "Forgive the intrusion," Miss Vale said smoothly, her gloved fingers brushing against the polished banister as she walked further inside. "But I believe you may be able to help me understand something." Margaret's hands tightened around the lace of her cuffs, the only sign of tension she allowed to slip through her carefully composed mask. "Understand what, exactly?" Miss Vale studied her closely before saying, "The letter," a flicker of hesitation, brief but there. Margaret's lips parted as if to protest, but then just as quickly she pressed them shut. "I have no knowledge of any letter." "Curious," Miss Vale murmured, her gaze drifting toward the study door at the end of the hall. "May I see where your husband spent his final hours?" Margaret hesitated before giving a stiff nod, turning without another word, and leading her down the dim corridor. Their footsteps echoed softly, swallowed by the thick carpeting, the weight of silence pressing heavier with each step. The study was a cavernous space, lined with towering shelves filled with books whose spines had not been touched in years. The scent of parchment and old leather thickened the air, mingling with the remnants of extinguished candle wax. A large mahogany desk stood at its heart, meticulously arranged, undisturbed. The chair was slightly turned, as though its occupant had risen in haste or been interrupted mid-thought. A decanter of brandy sat nearby, the glass beside it empty, yet smudged with fingerprints. Papers lay stacked, but something was missing, a gap, a space where something had once been. Miss Vale moved slowly, deliberately, her keen eye drinking in every detail. Then she paused. The fireplace lay cold, untouched, yet the faintest whisper of burnt paper lingered in the air. She moved closer, kneeling slightly to examine the grate. A charred edge of something remained, too small to make sense of, but enough to suggest that something had been destroyed in a hurry. And then something else. Her gaze shifted to the far side of the room. A thin, nearly imperceptible crack ran along the base of the bookcase, where a faint draught curled through, unsettling the dust on the floor. An unusual place for a breeze, she remarked softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the wood. Margaret's hands twitched at her sides. It's an old house, full of draughts. Miss Vale merely hummed in response, pressing her palm against the bookcase. A faint shift, almost imperceptible, but there. Interesting. A movement in the doorway drew her attention. Eliza Morley, the housekeeper, stood there, her expression composed, yet something unreadable lingered behind her eyes. "Miss Ashwick," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Shall I bring tea?" Margaret inclined her head. "Yes, thank you." Eliza turned, but not before Miss Vale caught the fleeting look in her eyes. Something wary, something unsaid. As they stepped back into the hall, Miss Vale paused, allowing the silence to settle around them. Outside, the village carried on as if untouched by the storm brewing beneath its surface. The streets, the familiar faces, the mundane rhythm of life, it all moved with the illusion of normalcy, but illusion was all it was, because beneath the quiet Blackthorn Hollow was shifting. The letter had come at just the right time. The study held whispers of something more, and someone somewhere had just made their move. The wind rattled the shutters of the small parlor, sending a flicker through the candlelight as Evelyn Harrow sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the scurrying ants tracing an invisible path along the window ledge. Their movements were frantic, urgent, as if compelled by some unseen force. It was strange how such tiny creatures seemingly lost in their own endless toil could appear so singularly focused on something beyond human comprehension. In that moment she felt an odd kinship with them. She too was caught in a quiet urgency, drawn towards something elusive yet inevitable. But before her thoughts could unravel further, the door behind her creaked open, dragging her attention away from the window. Mrs. Caldwell entered like a gust of wind, her presence filling the room with restless energy as she clutched a wicker basket overflowing with fresh produce. "Evelyn, you would not believe what I've just heard," she announced, her voice thick with excitement, the kind she reserved for the kind of gossip that could send ripples through the still waters of the village. She set the basket down, barely able to contain herself. "Do you remember Adam Blackwood, the young man with more ambition than sense?" Evelyn turned slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Yes, what about him?" Mrs. Caldwell leaned in as if the very walls might listen. "He had a terrible row with his father, just days before the murder, and not just a simple argument, mind you. A proper shouting match, the sort of thing that makes people wonder." She let the words hang, watching Evelyn for a reaction. Evelyn merely folded her hands, her expression calm, but her mind already dissecting the implications. "I imagine quite a few people have had words with Charles Blackwood in the past. He wasn't exactly beloved." Mrs. Caldwell waved a dismissive hand. "True enough, but this was different. People heard Adam call his father a blind old fool, and get this, Charles told him he was making a mistake he'd regret for the rest of his life." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her mind clicking through the possibilities. A father and son at odds, a looming decision, and now murder. "Did anyone else hear this?" she asked, her voice deceptively light. Mrs. Caldwell nodded eagerly. "Oh, plenty. Marjorie Wilkes for one. She was tending to the shop and said she could hear them clear as day from across the road. And Henry Dobbs, the postman, he swears they were going at it like animals. Something about the will, if you ask me. You know how Charles was, always holding the purse strings tight. And Adam, well, let's just say he's not exactly one for patience. At the mention of the will, Evelyn's attention sharpened. A flicker of something unseen began threading itself through the gaps of what she already knew. Interesting, she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the kettle warming on the stove. And what of the staff at Blackwood Manor? You're familiar with Iris Dane, aren't you? Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough for Evelyn to notice. Yes, of course, she's been with the Blackwoods for nearly 20 years, practically part of the furniture, but she's always been the quiet sort, not one for gossip. A pause, then again 20 years is a long time to serve one family. People have their grievances. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. You think there's something more to her loyalty? A promise unfulfilled, perhaps? Mrs. Caldwell's eyes gleamed. That's exactly what I've been wondering. No one stays in a house that long, unless they're either deeply devoted or deeply entangled. And let's not forget, loyalty and silence often go hand in hand. Evelyn said nothing for a long moment, her mind drifting back to Iris Dane, the way she had watched silent and calculating, during Evelyn's brief visit to the manor. She had spoken little, but her eyes had spoken volumes. There was an awareness in her gaze, a knowledge she hadn't yet shared. You may be right, Evelyn murmured at last, her eyes returning to the window. But knowing something and being willing to reveal it are two very different things. People keep their secrets close, until they no longer have a choice. Mrs. Caldwell sat back, cradling her basket in her lap. I don't know how you do it, Evelyn. Always seeing the things the rest of us miss. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile. You'd be surprised what people reveal when they think no one is listening. A hush settled over the room. The only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Outside, the village carried on as it always did, unaware that, beneath its quiet exterior, the pieces of a much darker puzzle were slowly falling into place. The low hum of a clock echoed through the dimly lit parlor, the scent of aged paper and fading flowers hanging thick in the air. Eleanor Graves sat poised in her chair, her fingers absently tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup, though her mind was far from the present. The town of Windermere had never been known for its excitement, and now, a murder, a will, and whispers of betrayal swirled like a storm over the quiet streets. And Eleanor, ever the silent observer, had found herself in the eye of it. The knock at her door was sharp, impatient, breaking her reverie. She knew who it would be before she even rose from her seat. Daniel Whitford stood there, his frame tense, his sharp eyes darting past her, as if to ensure they were alone. His entrance was abrupt, a man burdened with thoughts he had yet to voice. "You wanted to see me," he stated, his voice controlled but taut. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying him, the way his fingers curled into his palms, the way his breath hitched just before speaking. "I find it curious, Daniel, how stories twist themselves in the telling. You were seen arguing with your father days before his death, were you not?" His jaw clenched. "Is that what they're saying?" "It's what I know," Eleanor corrected, her voice soft but firm. "Your father was a man who held his fortune above all else. And yet his will changed just before his murder." Daniel exhaled sharply, a humorless laugh escaping him. "You think I killed him for an inheritance I was never going to get?" He stepped closer, his presence looming, but Eleanor remained unmoved. "I wasn't even home that night. I was at the Bell Tavern. Half the town can confirm it." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Then tell me, Daniel, why was the new will never found?" The question hung between them, thick with unspoken implications. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "I don't know," he said, too quickly. Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, lies always unraveled, eventually. You know more than you're willing to say. Perhaps you didn't kill him, but someone did. And that missing will, it's no accident, is it? Daniel's fingers twitched. I don't have to listen to this, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He turned, a man retreating into the darkness of his own guilt, whether it was guilt of action or omission. Eleanor had yet to determine. As the door shut behind him, the night beyond seemed to grow darker, the air heavier with secrets. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was not yet clear. Eleanor sighed, her fingers tightening around her cup. The truth was near, she could feel it, a shadow lurking just beyond sight, waiting to be uncovered. The heavy air of dusk settled over the town of Blackwood, as Eleanor Thorne watched from her study window, her sharp eyes following the fading light that stretched across the cobbled streets. The hush of the evening was deceptive, masking the undercurrents of tension that wove through the town like an invisible thread. Something was unraveling, slowly surely, one pull at a time. A mystery, delicate yet insistent, whispered through the cold stone walls of Blackwood Hall, urging her to listen. The sudden knock at the door was sharp and impatient, shattering the fragile quiet. Eleanor rose from her armchair, adjusting the shawl draped over her shoulders, her movements measured but alert. As she reached for the door, she already knew who would be standing on the other side, Nathaniel Crowley. He stood rigid in the dim light, his tall frame tense, his jaw set in a line of barely restrained agitation. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with a weight that betrayed the turmoil beneath his carefully constructed exterior. "You sent for me," he said, his voice low, his tone clipped. His eyes, dark as a storm brewing over the moors, searched hers, wary yet unyielding. Eleanor closed the door behind him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I did," she said smoothly. "You see, Nathaniel, I've been thinking about your father's will." His stance shifted, imperceptibly to most, but not to Eleanor. A tightening of the shoulders, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I told you before," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "I don't know anything about it." "Oh, but you do," Eleanor countered, stepping past him toward the fireplace. The flames flickered and swayed, casting long shadows that danced over the dark-paneled walls, their restless movement mirroring the thoughts swirling in her mind. "You knew it had been altered, didn't you? And you knew that when your father was found dead, the new will was nowhere to be found." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "He never showed it to me," he admitted after a long pause. "Just mentioned changes. Changes that left you with nothing." Eleanor watching him carefully, "which means someone had a reason to make sure that will never surfaced." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled dark hair, frustration rolling off him in waves. "You think I killed him for a will I never even saw?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, the ghost of a knowing smile playing at her lips. "I think you had a great many reasons to want him gone," she replied, her voice dangerously soft. "But I also think you weren't the only one." The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken truths. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the window panes like an omen. Nathaniel's gaze dropped for the briefest moment, the weight of something unsaid pressing heavy on his shoulders. Then finally, he spoke. "Eliza," he said, barely more than a whisper. She knew everything. She was by his side longer than anyone. If there was a new will, she would have known where to find it. Eleanor's eyes darkened with understanding. Eliza had been a fixture in the Whitmore household for decades, a silent observer of every secret, every betrayal, and yet in the days following the death, her silence had been the loudest voice of all. "Then I suppose it's time we paid her a visit," Eleanor said, reaching for her coat. Nathaniel hesitated, as though waging an internal war. Then without another word, he followed her. The night stretched before them, thick with secrets waiting to be unearthed. "What I changed and improved." 1. Expanded descriptions. I deepened the atmospheric details, expanding the setting of Blackwood, adding more vivid imagery about the evening, the air of tension, and the flickering firelight to enhance suspense. 2. Stronger characterization. Nathaniel's internal turmoil is now more pronounced through subtle body language cues, tightened shoulders, flickering unease, running a hand through his hair. Eleanor's presence has also been made more commanding and analytical, reinforcing her role as the one piecing the mystery together. 3. Richer psychological depth. I intensified the psychological tension between Eleanor and Nathaniel, making their dialogue more layered with underlying motives and silent conflicts. 4. Increased suspense. By pacing the reveals more deliberately, lingering on Eleanor's deductions, Nathaniel's evasiveness, and the looming specter of the missing will, I made the mystery feel more pressing. 5. Stronger ending hook. The last line suggests that answers lie ahead, but leaves enough mystery to keep the reader intrigued, reinforcing the feeling that they are on the edge of something major being revealed. Let me know if you'd like even more expansion, or a different adjustment. Blackwood Manor stood cloaked in the heavy silence of the night, its ancient walls holding whispers of secrets long buried. Miss Eleanor Vale moved through the dimly lit corridors with quiet precision, her sharp gaze scanning the familiar surroundings for anything out of place. The air inside was thick with something unseen, a presence, a history woven into the very foundation of the estate. She had come at this hour for a reason. A crime had been committed, a murder that should have been impossible, and yet here she was, following the faintest thread of truth that no one else had noticed. The study, where Lord Whittaker had drawn his last breath, still held the eerie hush of unresolved tragedy. A locked room mystery, they called it. The door had been bolted from the inside. No signs of forced entry. No way in or out. And yet, the body had been found, lifeless in the very chair where he had once presided over this household with unshakable authority. The others believed it was suicide. Eleanor knew better. A slight shift in the air caught her attention. She turned, her keen eyes settling on something small yet deeply out of place. A key, rusted with age, hanging from an otherwise bare hook above the fireplace. Something about it gnawed at her, an instinct whispering that it did not belong. Curious, she murmured under her breath. Before she could reach for it, a voice broke the silence. "It's nothing," Eliza Graves spoke swiftly, stepping forward, her face carefully composed, too composed. Her hands moved with quiet urgency as she plucked the key from its resting place and slid it into the pocket of her apron. Just an old thing for the garden shed. A lie. Eleanor knew a lie when she heard one. The way Eliza avoided her gaze, the tension coiled in her fingers, it all pointed to something concealed beneath years of practiced subservience. "Of course," Eleanor said lightly, though her mind was already calculating. It was never just an old thing, and there were no garden sheds near the study where Lord Whittaker had been found. When Eleanor stepped out of the room, the weight of the house seemed to press in on her, the darkened halls whispering of things hidden in plain sight. She had seen it before, loyalty curdling into resentment, years of devotion soured into something far more dangerous. By the time she reached the grand staircase, her mind had already leaped ahead. She needed proof, she needed answers, and she knew precisely where to start. Inspector Harrington had been skeptical when she insisted on his return to the manor that evening. "Miss Vale," he grumbled as they stepped into the study once more, "this is a closed matter, a man locked in his own room, no sign of a struggle, and no footprints but his own. What more do you expect to find?" Eleanor ignored his impatience. She was listening, not to him, but to something else entirely, a whisper of air, a draught where there should be none. Moving toward the towering bookcase, she ran her fingertips along its edges, tapping lightly as she went. Then suddenly, she felt it, a shift, a mechanism long forgotten. A subtle click echoed in the silence. The bookcase trembled, Then, inch by inch, it swung open, revealing a passageway swallowed in darkness. "Impossible," Harrington breathed. Eleanor stepped forward, the scent of dust and something faintly metallic filling her lungs. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for two people, and the air within it held the distinct impression of recent disturbance. Someone had used this, someone had known, and they had escaped unseen. She moved carefully, tracing the passage's path with measured steps. It led downward, weaving through the very bones of the estate, finally emerging behind a disused pantry at the far end of the house. A route no one would have thought to check, except for someone who had walked these halls in silence for years. Someone like Eliza Graves. Eleanor turned to face the inspector, her voice measured but firm. The door was locked from the inside, yes, but there was never just one way out. Understanding dawned in Harrington's eyes, followed by something else, a realization that they had been looking at the crime the wrong way all along. The answer had been hidden beneath years of quiet servitude, an act of betrayal fueled by something deeper than greed. She had nothing left to lose, Eleanor murmured, her mind already piecing together the final threads of the puzzle, and a woman with nothing left is the most dangerous kind of all. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of truth finally brought to light. What I changed and improved: 1. More atmospheric and tense descriptions. The setting feels heavier, more alive, and the tension is thick throughout. I expanded on the eerie silence, the sense of history pressing in, and the unsettling presence of something unseen. 2. Sharper characterization. Miss Eleanor Vale is presented as observant, methodical, and unwavering in her pursuit of the truth. Eliza's nervous behavior is made more subtle but telling, making her motivations more compelling. 3. Expanded mystery and suspense. Instead of immediately discovering the hidden passage, I built up the search, allowing the tension to grow. The revelation feels more earned and impactful. 4. A stronger ending hook. The final realization leaves the reader with a lingering sense of intrigue and an open-ended question about what truly drove the crime. 5. More natural dialogue and pacing. The interactions feel more organic, and the pacing allows the suspense to build gradually rather than rushing to the conclusion. Let me know if you'd like any further tweaks. Dew clung to the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, glistening like scattered diamonds under the pale morning light, yet the grandeur of the estate was suffocated beneath an air thick with secrets. Eleanor Graves stood at the entrance, her gloved fingers brushing against the aged brass knocker, hesitating only for a moment before striking it against the heavy wooden door. Inside, the hush of expectation coiled through the corridors like an unseen force, each shadow stretched long and uncertain in the dim candlelight. Lord Hawthorne's death had sent ripples through the town. A man of stature, found lifeless in his own study, his wristwatch shattered, the hands frozen at precisely 10:42 p.m. It was an impossible death, they had whispered. The doors had been locked from the inside, the windows sealed, no sign of forced entry, and yet the subtle scent of smoldering tobacco had lingered in the air, a detail too precise to ignore. Eleanor stepped inside, her presence met with wary glances. Lady Hawthorne sat rigid in her high-backed chair, her mourning attire impeccable, yet her knuckles betrayed her, white from how tightly she clenched the silk handkerchief in her grasp. Beside her, Jonathan Hawthorne paced restlessly, his eyes flickering toward the grand fireplace as though the flames concealed the answers he sought. Across the room, Miss Lillian Kent, the governess, sat in unnerving silence, her gaze fixed upon the antique clock that now seemed little more than a cruel reminder of the night's events. The room itself held its own story, papers meticulously arranged on the desk, despite the apparent struggle, a glass of brandy untouched, an overturned chair, lying in quiet defiance of the order. But what drew Eleanor's attention most was the single cigar resting on the silver tray near the hearth, the ashtray beside it absent of any remnants, as though someone had deliberately cleaned it before the discovery of the body. A peculiar choice, Eleanor murmured, her voice measured, the weight of deduction pressing against every syllable. Not Lord Hawthorne's usual brand, wouldn't you agree? The question lingered, a silent challenge. Jonathan's fingers twitched, but it was Lady Hawthorne's breath that caught first, a momentary hesitation before she regained her composure. Eleanor noted it, filed it away, her gaze flickering toward the ornate grandfather clock in the corner, its steady ticking a cruel contrast to the frozen timepiece found at the scene. 10:42, she repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the numbers on her tongue, a detail too perfect, too deliberate. The watch had been broken, yes, but not in the struggle. No, it had been placed, positioned with intent, an illusion to deceive. And now, as the gathered faces exchanged glances thick with tension, Eleanor Graves knew the truth was waiting, just beyond the threshold of fear. The murderer had not simply taken Lord Hawthorne's life. They had woven a web so intricate, so meticulous, that even the time of death was a lie. But the flaw was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right hand to unravel it. Jonathan Blackwood stood in the heart of the dimly lit drawing room, his presence a shadow among shadows, the only sound the slow rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock against the far wall. The great Blackwood estate had seen its share of scandal, but tonight was different. The air hung heavy with unsaid words, with secrets clawing their way to the surface, and with the undeniable sense that someone in the room knew far more than they had let on. Eleanor Blackwood, the grieving widow, sat by the hearth, her lace-gloved fingers tracing the rim of an untouched teacup. Her face was composed, yet the flicker in her eyes betrayed something deeper, something more insidious. Across from her, Edwin Harrow, the family solicitor, adjusted his cravat, his usual confidence waning under the weight of unspoken accusations. Beside him, Lydia Moore, the housekeeper, stood rigid, her hands folded neatly, her face a mask of obedience, yet her knuckles had turned white from the force of her grip. The silence was unbearable. Then, with the deliberate patience of a predator, Jonathan spoke. "We are gathered here because the truth has been buried for too long." His voice was measured, each word laced with quiet authority. "Mr. Harrow, you insisted that Lord Blackwood's death was a tragic accident, but the inconsistencies in the coroner's report suggest otherwise. The bruising around the wrists, the broken pocket watch stopped at precisely 10:13 p.m., the strange scent of bergamot lingering in the study, these are not the details of a man who simply collapsed." Harrow swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair. "And you, Mrs. Blackwood," Jonathan continued, turning his gaze to Eleanor, whose composed facade remained eerily unbroken, "you claimed to have been asleep in your chambers, but the maid distinctly heard footsteps pacing near the west wing just after 10, yet no one else was meant to be there." A quiet tension gripped the room. Then came a whisper, a near imperceptible sound from Lydia Moore. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she murmured, her eyes darting to the flickering candlelight. Jonathan stepped closer. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Lydia?" Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the wind outside groaned against the old manor walls, the flames trembling in their sconces, shadows shifting as if the house itself was leaning in to listen. "You knew," Jonathan said, his voice low, deliberate. "You knew what was planned that night, didn't you?" Lydia's breath shuddered, her composure faltering. Bite. Before she could utter another word, the clock struck the half-hour, and somewhere in the depths of Blackwood Manor, a door creaked open, a sound so distant, yet so chilling, that even the most composed among them stiffened. Jonathan exhaled slowly. The puzzle was almost complete, the noose tightening around the truth, but one question remained: had they uncovered the lie in time, or was the real killer still watching from the shadows, waiting to silence them all? The air in Ashford Hall was thick with tension, the kind that settled in the bones and made the silence feel heavier than words ever could. At the center of the room, Inspector Harrington cleared his throat, his sharp gaze moving across the gathered guests, like a scalpel cutting through flesh. "We've uncovered a great deal tonight," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something unreadable. "But the pieces don't quite fit, at least not yet." The glow from the chandelier above cast eerie shadows across the walls, flickering as if the house itself was holding its breath. Lady Eleanor Ashford sat in her chair near the grand fireplace, her hands folded neatly over her lap, but the whiteness of her knuckles betrayed her tension. Beside her, Arthur Langley, the family solicitor, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, his lips pursed in something between thought and nervousness. Across from them Henry, the heir to the Ashford estate, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. "Who truly benefits from Lord Ashford's death?" Harrington's question cut through the stillness like a blade. Henry scoffed, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Not me, if that's what you're suggesting," he muttered, though his fingers twitched as he tapped his cigarette against the tray. "I never wanted any of this." "Not directly, perhaps," Harrington mused, his eyes never leaving Henry. "But there are debts, aren't there? And suddenly, with your father gone, they vanish, do they not?" A muscle ticked in Henry's jaw, but he said nothing. Lady Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her handkerchief. "Harold was being blackmailed," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't tell me by whom, but I know it was something from his past, something dangerous." A chill seemed to pass through the room. Harrington studied her carefully. "A secret worth killing for?" he asked. Before Eleanor could answer, the butler, Mr. Graves, cleared his throat. "There was a letter," he said, his voice hesitant. "It arrived the morning after Lord Ashford's death, claiming he had wronged someone, that justice had been served." The room stiffened at his words. Lydia, the maid, turned pale, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Harrington's eyes flickered toward her. "Lydia, do you know who sent it?" She swallowed hard but remained silent. The silence was damning. Harrington let it stretch, watching as the weight of unspoken truths pressed against her like a vice. Finally he turned, stepping toward the study doors. "Let's take another look at the place where Lord Ashford was found." The group hesitated before following. The study was just as it had been, a room frozen in time. The air was stale, the fireplace long since extinguished. Harrington moved to the large bookcase near the window, running his fingers along the wood. The door was locked from the inside. "Yes?" he asked. Yet, there was no key. A beat of silence, then a soft click. Harrington pressed against a hidden latch, and the bookcase groaned as it shifted. Behind it a narrow passage yawned into darkness, a way in and a way out. A quiet gasp escaped Lady Eleanor's lips. Henry's cigarette slipped from his fingers, landing forgotten on the rug. Lydia turned away, her shoulders shaking ever so slightly. The truth was unraveling, piece by piece, and somewhere in that passageway, hidden in the shadows, lay the answer they had all been too afraid to see. The night was thick with an eerie stillness. When Judge Alistair Crow's lifeless body was discovered in his private library, a locked room where only silence bore witness to the crime, Inspector Howard Grimshaw stepped cautiously into the dimly lit space, his sharp gaze scanning the towering wooden shelves lined with ancient legal tomes, their spines worn from years of deliberation over justice and deceit. A grandfather clock ticked methodically in the background, each second stretching the tension in the air. The butler, Enoch, his forehead glistening with nervous sweat, swallowed hard before speaking. "No one entered or left, Inspector. The door was locked from the inside." Near the judge's motionless hand lay a quill, its ink still fresh, and beside it, an unfinished document, a will, unsigned, its contents a mystery. Miss Eleanor Blackwood, a celebrated novelist and a close confidant of the judge, studied the room with an expression of quiet contemplation. "Men don't kill only for money," she murmured. "They kill to bury secrets." The words sent a shiver through the assembled guests, each of them a potential suspect. Judge Crow's estranged stepdaughter, Helena, clutched a pearl necklace with trembling fingers. Victor Lane, the judge's longtime assistant, kept his hands tightly clasped, his usual air of controlled composure showing cracks, and Beatrice Holloway, once the judge's closest ally, now stood apart, unreadable. Whoever killed Judge Crow didn't just take his life, Eleanor continued, her eyes landing on a small blood-stained leather diary resting atop the desk. They erased a truth that was never meant to come to light. Grimshaw carefully picked up the diary, flipping through its worn pages, his brows furrowed as he read, his breath hitching slightly. The case detailed within was an old one, an overturned verdict, a name that had long been buried under legal jargon and forgotten rulings. Was this murder an act of revenge? The inspector mused, turning to his deputy, Carter, or is there something even deeper at play? A sudden intake of breath cut through the room's silence. Helena, her voice hesitant, whispered, "Judge Crow warned me days ago. If something were to happen to him, I should ask Victor Lane why." Every eye snapped to Victor, whose face drained of color. "That's ridiculous," he sputtered, shifting uncomfortably. "I was just an assistant. I had nothing to do with this." Eleanor fixed him with a knowing stare. "You weren't just an assistant, Victor. You were the judge's shadow, recording everything he said and did. If anyone knew what skeletons he had locked away, it was you." The room felt smaller now, the very walls pressing in as the weight of unspoken truths thickened the air. Grimshaw exhaled slowly, his gaze sweeping over the crime scene once more. Murderers always make mistakes. Somewhere in this room, the answer is waiting to be found. Eleanor closed the blood-stained diary with a soft thud. To find the killer, we must understand the judge's final words. But as the tension rose, so did a dreadful realization: if the truth was this dangerous, would another life be taken before it was uncovered? The air inside Blackthorn Manor was thick with the weight of unspoken truths as Inspector Edmund Carlyle surveyed the room where Lord Reginald Ashford had been found dead. The study, once a place of intellect and power, was now a crime scene, its grand oak desk littered with overturned papers, a single candle flickering in the dimness. A sense of something unfinished lingered in the air, as though the very walls of the manor whispered of secrets yet to be unearthed. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, the sharp-witted governess, stood near the window, her hands clasped as though restraining some deep emotion. "It's strange, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice almost lost beneath the distant roll of thunder outside. Lord Ashford had been rewriting his will. The new version was meant to be signed today, yet now he's gone. Her words sent a ripple of unease through the room. The lawyer, Mr. Harrington, adjusted his spectacles nervously, the dim light catching the glint of sweat forming at his temple. "Indeed, and what's even more troubling is that the original will, the one still in effect, is missing." Silence fell, the realization settling in like a slow-moving storm. Someone had stolen the will, ensuring the changes Lord Ashford intended would never come to pass. But who had the most to gain? Miss Whitmore's sharp eyes flickered to the others in the room. Lord Ashford's estranged nephew, Victor Ashford, a man whose financial troubles were whispered about in hushed tones, Beatrice Holloway, the housekeeper, whose loyalty had always been questioned, and Julian Fairfax, a close friend of the late lord, now standing stiffly, his fingers drumming against the arm of a chair. "It's curious," Miss Whitmore said, stepping forward, her voice calm yet laced with something deeper, certainty. "Just yesterday, Lord Ashford confided in me that he suspected someone in this very house of deceiving him. He was going to take action, but now—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. Inspector Carlyle lifted the silver ink pot from the desk, his keen gaze narrowing at the deep red stain on its rim. "Blood," he muttered, his mind working through the implications. This wasn't just about inheritance, this was about silencing a truth. Julian Fairfax shifted uncomfortably, his usual air of charm now laced with something else, unease. "Surely, you're not implying—" "I'm implying," Miss Whitmore cut in, "that Lord Ashford's death was premeditated. The will vanished at the precise moment it would have changed the future. That's not coincidence, it's intent." Inspector Carlyle's eyes locked onto Victor, whose face had paled considerably. "You were seen entering the study last night, Mr. Ashford, yet you claim you never spoke to your uncle?" Victor's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as he forced himself to meet the inspector's gaze. "I had no reason to harm him." "No?" Miss Whitmore's voice was a whisper of intrigue, yet there was steel beneath her words. "And yet your uncle was disinheriting you. Who else stood to lose more than you?" Before Victor could respond, a knock echoed through the tense silence. A maid stepped in, hesitating before speaking. "This just arrived," she said, holding a sealed envelope. Inspector Carlyle took it, breaking the wax seal. The letter inside, scrawled in Lord Ashford's unmistakable hand, read, "If anything happens to me, the truth lies with Julian Fairfax." The inspector looked up sharply. Julian's fingers had stopped drumming. A single bead of sweat trailed down his temple. Miss Whitmore smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it, only a sharp, knowing edge. "I think we're getting closer, Inspector. Much closer." The dimly lit corridors of Blackwood Hall whispered secrets long buried beneath its ancient stone walls. Detective Evelyn Harrow stood in the grand parlour, her keen gaze fixed on the mahogany desk, where Lord Alistair Wakefield had been found lifeless just hours ago, a half-smoked cigar resting near his stiffened fingers. The crime scene bore no signs of forced entry, no struggle, only an unsettling stillness that spoke volumes. Across from her the housekeeper, Mrs. Linwood, twisted her hands nervously. "Milord had been restless of late," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "He spoke of changing his will, of correcting past mistakes." That single sentence sent a ripple through Evelyn's mind, just as she had suspected. The will, someone had a reason to ensure Lord Wakefield never signed it. She turned her attention to Henry Wakefield, the heir apparent, seated stiffly on the velvet chaise, his expression a careful mask of grief and calculation. "It's unfortunate," she mused, tilting her head slightly, "that the only will now enforceable benefits you entirely, while the revised version, poof, has conveniently disappeared." Henry's fingers twitched against his knee. "Are you accusing me of murder, detective?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too controlled. Evelyn simply smiled. "Not yet." A sudden knock at the parlour doors made everyone turn. A butler entered hesitantly, holding a yellowed telegram slip. "This arrived for you, sir," he addressed Henry, but Evelyn intercepted it with a quick motion. Her eyes scanned the words, and a slow, knowing smirk formed on her lips. "Curious," she said. "A message sent on the night of Lord Wakefield's death, and not from you, but about you." She flicked her gaze to the butler. "Who sent this?" The man hesitated. "Miss Clara Ashworth, my lady, the governess." Evelyn's heart quickened. Clara, who had been unusually silent, lurking in the shadows of this investigation, was the key. The doors burst open again, and there stood Clara, pale but composed. "I sent the telegram," she admitted, "because I saw something that night." Silence draped over the room like a heavy shroud. "I saw Henry slip into Lord Wakefield's study after midnight, and when he left, the cigar was still burning." The room tensed. Henry's composure cracked, his jaw tightening, as his gaze darted toward the exit. Evelyn took a step forward. "It's over, Henry. You orchestrated this entire thing, didn't you? Manipulated the missing will, ensured your father never signed the new one, and planted just enough doubt to keep the suspicion off you. But there's one thing you didn't count on." She turned the telegram in her fingers. "Someone was always watching." Henry's breath hitched, then like a predator backed into a corner, he bolted for the door, but Evelyn was faster. With a swift motion, she blocked his path, her voice calm but commanding. "The game is up, Mr. Wakefield." Outside, the storm rumbled as though the house itself exhaled a long-held secret. The truth was out, and justice at last was closing in. It was a dark, frigid night, when Evelyn Graves pulled her coat tightly around herself. The winds of St. Albans carried a chill, but the secrets lurking within them were colder and far more cutting. Whitaker Mansion, once a symbol of grandeur, now stood like a looming shadow, its walls holding the weight of silent mysteries. Evelyn glanced at her watch. 9 p.m. Time was slipping away, and she knew she had little of it left. Peter Whittaker, a name that was not just that of an heir but also a crucial thread in the tangled web of deception, sat in the dimly lit drawing room, his fingers tapping anxiously against the armrest of his chair. On the table before him lay a half-smoked cigar, small, insignificant to the untrained eye, yet a damning clue to Evelyn. She picked up the cigar stub, turning her sharp gaze toward Peter. "This is yours, Peter." Her voice was devoid of warmth. "And it was found at the very spot where your father was murdered." A flicker of panic crossed Peter's face. His eyes darted from Evelyn to Inspector Howard, searching for a way out. "No, I don't even smoke cigars." His throat went dry, but Evelyn wasn't about to let him escape so easily. Inspector Howard, who had thus far observed in silence, finally stepped forward. "There's no use lying, Peter," he said, his tone firm. "Tom Woodley told us that you didn't arrive at the pub when you claimed you did. In fact, you were nearly 20 minutes late, the exact window in which your father was murdered." Peter gripped the sides of his chair. "No, I'm telling the truth." But his trembling hands betrayed him. Evelyn exhaled slowly, pulling out the real piece of evidence, a half-burned letter found in the fireplace ashes. Every word on it burned with the weight of the truth. "Your father threatened to expose you, Peter. He wrote that if you didn't stop your reckless behavior, he would reveal your lies, your debts, your fraud, everything. And that night, you made your decision, didn't you?" Peter swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room like a cornered animal. Inspector Howard delivered the final blow. "Your father's pocket watch was found stopped at 9:15. We assumed that was his time of death, but Evelyn discovered that the watch was placed there deliberately. The killer manipulated time." Evelyn nodded. "And that killer is you, Peter. Everything points to you. Can you still deny it?" Peter's mother, Margaret, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Peter, my son, you have to tell the truth." Her voice was thick with sorrow. Peter took a deep breath, but not a single word left his lips. Evelyn spoke softly. "The truth always finds its way out, Peter. And this truth won't let you hide forever." Only one question remained: was Peter the only guilty one, or was there another mastermind lurking in the shadows? Evelyn knew the true story was far from over. The real truth was just one step away. The grand halls of Blackwood Manor were draped in an eerie silence, the flickering candlelight casting restless shadows that twisted upon the towering walls. The room, once a symbol of opulence, now felt suffocating, its heavy velvet drapes absorbing every whisper of unease. Seated in the center, Edmund Lancaster, his face drawn and pale, clutched the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white against the polished wood. Around him the others had gathered, Isabel, her fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her dress. Victor standing near the fireplace, his gaze dark and brooding, and Margaret, her trembling hands folded in her lap, a quiet storm brewing behind her eyes. The moment had come for the truth to emerge, for the web of deceit to finally be unraveled. Detective Evelyn Harrow stood near the grand window, her silhouette barely illuminated by the dim glow of the chandelier overhead. The fog outside crept along the grounds, swallowing the world beyond, sealing them inside the weight of their own secrets. She turned slowly, her gaze sharp as steel, her voice cutting through the silence. "We have arrived at the end of this charade. The lies, the misdirections, they all collapse under the weight of one immutable thing, the truth." Edmund shifted, his breath shallow, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. "What truth?" he muttered. Though the question rang hollow, Evelyn took a step forward, her eyes never leaving him. "The night Lord Blackwood died, you were the last to see him alive. The account you gave was carefully crafted, a precise illusion meant to divert suspicion. You spoke of an argument, of heated words exchanged, but you omitted the most damning detail, the moment you struck him, the moment you ensured that he would never rise again. Isabel let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her lips. Victor exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening, while Margaret remained frozen, her expression unreadable. Edmund's fingers twitched. He hesitated, his voice cracking. I never meant, but you did. Evelyn interrupted, her tone firm yet devoid of cruelty. You meant every moment of it. You meant to manipulate the evidence, to stage the scene, to make it appear as if time itself had betrayed us. The broken pocket watch found by his side, it wasn't a mere coincidence, it was a calculated deception, meant to trick us into believing his death occurred earlier than it did. But mistakes were made, weren't they? The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Victor's eyes narrowed, his voice like a low growl. You set the fire in the study, you burned the letter that would have exposed you. But the embers, Edmund, the embers don't lie. They tell a story of their own. Evelyn nodded. The flames were meant to erase the truth, to obscure your crime. But they left behind something far more valuable, a piece of parchment, half burned, but enough to reveal the threat your father made to disown you. The moment he penned those words, you knew you had no choice. Your life of comfort, your inheritance, everything would have been taken from you. And so you ensured that he would never have the chance. Margaret let out a broken sob, her frail form trembling. Edmund, tell me it's not true. But the confession was already written in his silence. His shoulders sagged, his breath uneven, his carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. His voice, barely above a whisper, cracked as he finally spoke. I didn't want to lose everything. I just needed time to fix things. Evelyn's gaze softened, but the resolve in her eyes never wavered. The past cannot be undone, Edmund, and now the truth stands before you, unshakable. A heavy knock echoed through the chamber doors. The final reckoning had arrived. As Inspector Hale stepped inside, his presence an unspoken verdict, Edmund lowered his head. The grand halls of Blackwood Manor had seen many tragedies, but none so haunting as the one unfolding now. And as the night deepened, so too did the weight of the secrets that had at last been dragged into the light. It was a dark night, the moon's dim glow casting long shadows over the golden windows of Whitaker Hall, but inside, an air of unease hung thick. Within the cold walls of Drayford House, a murder mystery lay entangled, a story that would finally unravel tonight. Inspector Graves tightened his grip on the handcuffs, his gaze locked onto Harland Vane, the man who had until now worn the mask of innocence, but whose pale face betrayed the weight of his guilt. Harland Vane, Graves' voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. You are under arrest for the murder of your wife, Eleanor Vane. The room fell into a stunned hush. Harland let out a nervous chuckle, a brittle, wavering laugh that reeked of desperation, but as the seconds passed, his smile withered, fading into something far more fragile. You all think I'm guilty. His voice trembled with an odd mix of defiance and despair. But do you know the truth? I was only the victim of love, a love that could never be mine. His breath hitched, his eyes darting between the accusing faces around him. I didn't kill her. She forced me into a corner. Eleanor found out about everything. I couldn't leave her. She said if I ever tried, she'd ruin me. His hands twitched as if grasping for an escape. But Miss Marple, who had been silently observing from the dimly lit corner, stepped forward, her keen gaze fixed on Harland's contorted expression. But the truth, Harland, her voice was as cold as steel, is that your so-called love was nothing but a mask, a shield you used to win your own twisted battle. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her words. Harland turned to look around. He could feel it now, the tightening noose of suspicion encircling him. You're lying, he whispered, but his face, drained of all color, revealed the very truth he was desperate to deny. The truth wears many faces, Harland, Miss Marple said softly, but the face you showed Eleanor was the one that led to her death. A suffocating silence took hold. Then slowly, as if the fight had been ripped from his very soul, Harlan's body slumped. She forced my hand. His voice was barely more than a breath now, hollow and broken. I thought I could get away, but you, he let out a dry, bitter laugh. You all cornered me. Inspector Graves wasted no time. With a sharp click, the handcuffs locked around Harlan's wrists. The truth never stays hidden in the dark forever. Graves' voice was calm, resolute. And tonight yours has come to light. A heavy silence settled over Drayford House, thick with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But outside, beyond the suffocating darkness, the moon still shone, silent, indifferent, an untouched witness to the shadows that had finally been unmasked. The village of Blackwood Hollow had returned to its quiet, predictable rhythm, but beneath the surface whispers still lingered like shadows refusing to fade. Life went on, the sun still rose, the market still bustled, and the church bells still rang, but those who had witnessed the tragedy knew that some wounds never truly healed. Inspector Caldwell sat in the dim glow of his study, the embers in the fireplace casting flickering shapes along the walls. The case was closed, yet his mind refused to let it rest. He had seen too much, uncovered secrets so dark they left an imprint on his soul. Eleanor Blackwood's murder had shattered the illusion of tranquility, exposing the rot beneath the village's polished veneer. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling shutters, and carrying with it the hushed conversations of those who still feared the truth. At the vicarage, Miss Eliza Harrow sipped her tea, her sharp gaze flickering toward the Reverend, who sat in pensive silence. "The village will forget soon enough," she mused, her voice barely above a whisper. "They always do. Scandal is like a fire, hot, consuming, but eventually, only ashes remain." The Reverend exhaled slowly, his fingers steepled before him. "Perhaps. But some sins leave scars, Eliza, and some ghosts never truly rest." He glanced toward the window, where the Blackwood estate loomed in the distance, its grand silhouette now tainted by blood. Meanwhile, Charlotte Blackwood sat alone in the parlor of her crumbling family home, the weight of solitude pressing upon her. Her father was gone, lost to the same treachery that had stolen Eleanor's life. Justice had been served, yet the emptiness remained, a void that no verdict could fill. She traced the rim of her untouched tea with trembling fingers, haunted by the whispers that had once echoed through these walls. She had loved a man who had been both her salvation and her downfall, and now all that remained were memories, and the bitter taste of betrayal. Beyond the estate, life continued. Children laughed in the village square, boots scuffing against the cobbled streets as they played without knowledge of the darkness that had so recently engulfed their home. The merchants exchanged pleasantries, the bakers peddled their wares, and the inn's patrons drank as if drowning the past in ale. But beneath it all, in the hush of night, there were still those who wondered, who questioned whether the story had truly ended. Because in Blackwood Hollow, secrets had a way of resurfacing, and though the case was closed, the village would never truly be free of its ghosts. The village of Ravenshade had settled back into its usual rhythm, its people going about their daily routines as if the storm of the past few months had never arrived. But the whispers never truly stopped. They lingered like ghosts in the quiet spaces between conversations, in the way hands hesitated on doorknobs, in the wary glances exchanged beneath the flickering street lamps. Life moved on, as it always did, but some wounds were too deep to fade entirely. Outside the old butcher shop, Mrs. Lovell was recounting the events once more, her voice dipping into hushed excitement even as her audience feigned boredom. They had all heard it before, yet no one ever truly tired of the tale. It was human nature, after all. No matter how much people claimed to crave normalcy, they could never resist the pull of a mystery left unresolved. Miss Eleanor Vance stood on the porch of her small cottage, her sharp gaze scanning the village square with practiced ease. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and beyond the rooftops, storm clouds gathered like an omen of things yet to come. The villagers had returned to their usual gossip, the weather, the new shipment of goods at the general store, but beneath their chatter she could still hear it. The name that had once been spoken with familiarity now carried the weight of disgrace. Vincent Holloway. His downfall had shaken the village to its core, unraveling a web of deceit so intricately woven that even those closest to him had failed to see it. Justice had been served, yet the past had a way of lingering like the last echo of a fading song. Turning away, Eleanor stepped into her garden, the scent of roses rising to meet her. She knelt among the blooms, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals, but her mind remained elsewhere. It was in the details, the small things people overlooked, that the truth always revealed itself. And she had learned long ago that patterns never truly disappeared, they merely changed shape. As she worked, the quiet rustle of paper reached her ears, and moments later, a letter slipped through her mailbox with a soft thud. Wiping the dirt from her hands, she retrieved the envelope, immediately recognizing the familiar precise handwriting. Inspector Harrow, a polite thank you for her assistance, a formal acknowledgement of the role she had played in unraveling the Holloway affair. It was respectful, appreciative, but unnecessary. She had not done it for recognition, she had done it because the truth had demanded to be found. Sighing, she set the letter aside, allowing her gaze to drift once more toward the village square. The sun was beginning to set, casting elongated shadows across the cobblestone streets. Soon, the lanterns would flicker to life, and the village would settle into the comforting embrace of the night. But Eleanor knew better than to be lulled into a false sense of peace. Beneath the surface, there was always something lurking, something waiting for the right moment to make itself known. People were creatures of habit, repeating their mistakes in endless cycles, always believing they were clever enough to hide their secrets. But no secret stayed buried forever. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and Eleanor let a small smile touch her lips. Ravenshade had seen its fair share of scandals, but mystery had a way of creeping back in when least expected. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the truth was never truly finished. It simply waited in the shadows, biding its time until someone was willing to see it. The village would rest tonight, slipping into the illusion of calm, but Eleanor, she would wait. Because somewhere just beyond the veil of normalcy, another mystery was already beginning to unfold.